Andreas then began wondering about Rodlin Academy Magic Tower and the highest floor ever reached in the history of the Academy, which was the 25th floor. This record was set by none other than Maximin Kronel. Later, after his graduation from Rodlin, he became known as the Walking Calamity and became one of the strongest aura masters on the continent. Andreas then, looking at the notification board, thought how despite the tower being such a place that even a man like that failed to reach the top, but not even 10 minutes after entering the tower, both Diane Alvin and Vivienne Belrican had passed through the first floor, which made Andreas question himself if they really broke through the first floor already. Meanwhile, all the students and professors present there were also left in a state of awe as they read the notification. As the vigorous battle continued for many days, on the fourth day, after the start of the midterm exams, one of the students watching Diane battle exclaimed how unbelievable it was, as it had only been 4 days. Then, as Diane could be seen gasping for air, the host suddenly announced that after a long and deadly battle, Diane Alvin had emerged victorious. Furthermore, he pointed out how nobody had been able to break through that floor since Maximin Cornell, the strongest swordsman on the continent. Instantly, as Diane defeated the monster, she clenched her fists in excitement, and with eyes filled with determination, she yelled, "I did it." Furthermore, she was glad that she had defeated the 20th floor's boss and that now that wall had been broken. At the same time, everyone that were watching Diane were left in a state of shock as some of them exclaimed how impressive that was. Instantly, one of the nobles that were sitting next to the Tower Master, Bard Alvin, congratulated the Tower Master, further stating that she was the first mage in history to do that, to which the Tower Master turned his glance toward the voice of the noble. He then told him that there was no need for such a fuss, as it was nothing compared to the Imperial Palace's original tower. Furthermore, he pointed out that it was merely because Maximin's record was broken too late. Bard Alvin, then looking at Vivienne's battle, claimed that Diane was not the only one to make history, while Vivienne jumped back to descent against the huge explosion attack of the monster. The monster then looked furiously towards Vivienne as it charged towards her. But the monster was no threat to Vivienne, as she calmly glanced towards the monster who was rushing towards her. Vivienne, then sensing the direction of the monster, swiftly jumped and dodged the monster, while the monster's attack destroyed the ground where she was standing. Vivienne then effortlessly landed on the ground behind the huge monster that was desperately trying to kill her. Vivienne, then staring at the monster, wondered how it had speed that didn't match its size. Then, as the monster finally turned towards Vivienne with a fierce look, Vivienne began to wonder how it was just like that time, and began to reminisce about the incident where she was almost defeated by the huge monster. But this time was different because since that day, she had been training without missing a single day. Vivienne then began to emit a mysterious glow from her eyes and body and took a battle stance prepared to defeat the monster. Simultaneously, the monster, without any hesitation, went on a rampage and jumped towards Vivienne, determined to destroy her. Vivienne then immediately swung her sword and sent multiple swings at the monster as it was approaching her. The huge monster then landed exactly where Vivienne was standing and destroyed the ground, while Vivienne swiftly jumped back to dodge it. Vivienne then, without any moment of hesitation, launched multiple swings at the monster. Meanwhile, the huge monster tried to attack Vivienne, but failed as the swings sent by Vivienne were so powerful that it cut the monster in several places. Vivienne then, with a cunning smile, kept torturing the monster by sending multiple swings at the monster, making it unable to attack and jump in frustration. But it was still not over, as Vivienne immediately dodged in the opposite direction of the monster, while the monster kept staring at Vivienne's movements. Vivienne then, without wasting any time, decided to end this and grabbed her sword with both hands, prepared to send a devastating blow to the monster. Vivienne then, with a devilish smile, swung her sword with all her might and was able to succeed in slicing the monster apart. This sudden turn of events made everyone that was watching their fight open their mouths and eyes wide open in shock. Simultaneously, the host announced that Vivienne Belrican had succeeded in completing the 20th floor right after Diane Alvin. Suddenly, one of the nobles from the audience, with a look of astonishment, questioned if that was the daughter of the Belrican family and pointed out how amazing she was. In response, the one behind the noble, with a worried look, pointed out, stating that the way she looked was like she was possessed by madness. Suddenly, a mysterious woman who was sitting next to them responded to their conversation by questioning them if not everything beautiful had its thorns. Further, she also pointed out that if Vivienne could tame the beast within her. The mysterious woman was none other than the Duchess of Morhaime, named Minas Morhaime, who had a scar on her right eye and a cunning smile. She then concluded that Vivienne might be able to rise above all others. Soon, both Diane and Vivienne reached the devilish 21st floor, but unfortunately the 21st floor could not be cleared, and both had to give up there. Both Diane along with Vivienne then came out of the magic towers where many students had gathered to congratulate them by claiming how they were amazing and how they were the pride of the fourth year, which left Diane along with Vivienne puzzled. All the students surrounding them kept applauding them on their successful operation up to the 21st floor. Diane then turned towards Vivienne and told her that she made it to the 21st floor too, and congratulated her, to which Vivienne just stared at her. Then Vivienne, glancing the other side, told Diane that she made it a bit farther than her. So Vivienne claimed that it was her win, while Diane just stood there in complete silence staring at Vivienne. Then with a worried smile, Diane told Vivienne that if she put it that way, then she had defeated the 20th floor boss first. Vivienne, then looking towards the other side, told Diane that it was still her win, hearing that all Diane could do was give an annoyed expression. Suddenly Andreas came walking towards them and congratulated them on making it to the 21st floor. Diane then, with a smile, instantly told him that it was kind of a shame, though she only made it to the 21st floor despite all her big talk. Meanwhile, Vivienne just kept staring at Andreas. Andreas then pointed out that it was a whole different dimension beyond the 20th floor, and that not just anyone could make it there. In response, Diane exclaimed what and told him that he sounded like he had experienced it before, to which Andreas claimed no way and told her that he just read the records in the library. Suddenly, the host called for the next entrance from number 21 to 40 and told him to please line up in front of the tower. Hearing this, Andreas pointed out that it was his turn and that he better get going. Diane then instantly told Andreas that she was looking forward to seeing him reach the top, while Vivienne just gave a jealous glance. Andreas then turned around and was about to leave, but was suddenly stopped by Vivienne, who called out for Andreas. Vivienne then, with the most innocent and lovely expression in her eyes, and with cheeks blushing red, told Andreas to do his best. In response, Andreas, with a slight smile, bent his head slightly and told Vivienne yes, and that he would see her later. Andreas then entered the portal, and at the same time in the back of his mind he wondered how ironic it was, as at first she was the person he wanted to avoid most, but she was the person he trusted the most. Andreas then, with a determined look in his eyes, decided that he had to overcome all odds that were against him. With his sword in his hand, Andreas then calmly began to walk towards the traps that were set ahead of him and told himself to let's do this. In the meantime, Vivienne began to reminisce about the time when Diane was teasing her by asking what about her, and that she thought the two of them suit each other well, while Andreas told Diane to please stop as it was rude to Vivienne. In response, Vivienne, who was blushing all over, told them that it was not true, to which Diane just questioned with a huh. Then Vivienne, who was overwhelmed by her emotions, ran away from them while telling them that it was not rude at all. Vivienne then came back to reality, as she was still blushing with excitement as she thought about how she had just confessed. Meanwhile, Diane, who was standing beside Vivienne, was dumbfounded by Vivienne's action and looked at her in confusion. At the same time, Andreas, who had entered the magic tower, was demonstrating exceptional skill, as he had cleared the first floor in 12 minutes and 3 seconds. Then, as time went on, Andreas just kept climbing the floor. He cleared the 3rd floor in 1 hour and 3 minutes. Andreas then reached the 8th floor, and after defeating all the monsters there, he cleared it in 6 hours 45 minutes, which was the fastest time. Then Andreas reached the 98th floor and cleared it in 7 hours 33 minutes. After the continued relentless battle, Andreas also needed some rest. So, as he felt hungry, he decided to start a fire and rest there. He then began eating the rat he just cooked, then opened his status window to check how much he had grown in a short time. Then, looking at his status window, he understood that now that his black magic talent had evolved, it had turned into a talent for the whole black magic system, and not just necromancy. Furthermore, he knew that thanks to the successful creation of Lucia's cure, his potion talent had also evolved. Then Andreas, as he ate, he began to wonder about the talent that grew thanks to Belial's tutoring, which was element magic, which had reached mediocre level. Andreas, then reminiscing about the professor, thought how that guy gave him a skeptical look when he suddenly succeeded at something he hadn't been able to do for hours, but dismissed the thought as at least that weirdo was useful. After analyzing everything, Andreas decided to see the chance of evolution of his new talent. Then the system notification showed Andreas that his element magic had 74% chance to evolve, which made Andreas think how at that rate he should be able to gain enough experience by the time he left the tower. So he decided that he should focus on using element system skills to gain as much as possible. Andreas then checked all his equipment and found that he had only 2 magic jamming positions left, which was not exactly reassuring. Andreas, then laying on the ground, thought how for now he should just get some rest, as he knew things won't be so easy anymore from the 10th floor onwards. On the second day after entering the tower, Andreas had reached the 10th floor, where he had to face another strong monster. The monster Andreas was facing was none other than an iron golem, who had magic circles on its arm as it tried to kill Andreas. But that was not enough, as Andreas, using his intellect, had disabled its shield and was wondering how so far it was good. Then the iron golem began emitting red light in the center of its face, which looked like a laser beam was going to be launched. But this was no surprise to Andreas, as he already knew what he had to do and jumped out of the direction where the laser was aimed. Then, as Andreas continued to dodge the laser, he exclaimed, "Here it comes," as he already knew that once its shields were down, it would start attacking while randomly changing the location of its magic core to 4 different locations: one of its arms, its head, or its chest. Instantly moving close to the iron golem, Andreas decided that he should first try its right arm and jumped close to its arm. Andreas then, in a split second, infused his black magic into his sword, which made his sword transform, covering it in a mysterious black aura. Simultaneously, Andreas then, without hesitation, slashed the iron golem's right arm, while the iron golem tried to attack Andreas. The iron golem was taken aback by the mysterious black aura suddenly covering his right arm, while Andreas, who was in midair, figured out that its core was not in its arm. Andreas then, taking out the potion, decided to use the potion and end that fight quickly. Andreas then threw the potion on the iron golem's head, which left the iron golem puzzled as to what that potion could be. As the iron golem tried to comprehend what that potion was, Andreas immediately threw another potion on its chest, making the iron golem even more dumbfounded as to what was happening. At the same time, Andreas had finally figured out that the core of the iron golem was on the very place that he had still not attacked. Andreas then dashed towards the iron golem's left arm and decided to slash its arm to figure out if he was right. Meanwhile, the iron golem, sensing the danger it was in, prepared its laser to attack Andreas. But for Andreas, that was nothing, as he swiftly turned his head to dodge the laser. Andreas then swung his sword covered in mysterious black aura and slashed the iron golem's left arm into 2 halves, which created a huge purple explosion. Andreas's slash was so powerful that it caused a huge explosion on the iron golem's hand from where Andreas jumped out. Simultaneously, as Andreas effortlessly landed after his attack, while the iron golem, which was still standing without its left arm, looked lifeless and defeated. Andreas then, putting his sword back, exclaimed within and decided to see how many floors Ben could climb today. As Andreas glanced at the destruction he had caused, he was being aired live on the display device. Instantly, the anchor, with excitement in his voice, yelled, 7 minutes. In just 7 minutes, Andreas Cromwell, on top of beating Maximin's record of 8 minutes, also defeated the 10th floor's iron golem in the fastest time in the Academy's history. Looking at Andreas on the display device, one of the elders exclaimed how that boy was amazing, while Bart Alvin, with his hands on his waist, was keenly looking at Andreas as well. With a look of surprise, he told how not only was he capable of planning and carrying out the strategy he had planned, but he also had the resourcefulness to use his biggest strength potions in battle accordingly. He further said that Andreas acted as if he had been through the tower before. The elder, with confusion in his eyes and sweat dripping from his face, praised Andreas, stating what a clever and bold student he was, and if he were to keep that up, he might actually surpass Maximin's record of 25 floors as well. Meanwhile, Bart was glancing towards him, watching him praise and compliment Andreas nonstop, but soon gave a serious look and commented how he couldn't say if he would get that far, but he could tell him that not only were the most influential and wealthy people in the Empire there, but also the eyes and ears of the Imperial Court. As he concluded, saying how from now on, the whole Empire would be paying close attention to Andreas Cromwell. Several mysterious characters from all around the Empire gazed at him with a look of surprise on their face as they witnessed Andreas's fight and capabilities, while one of the characters, gazing towards Andreas, grinned as she concluded how another monster existed as well. It was the 5th day of the exam. A huge explosion occurred inside the tower. The explosion was from a huge Minotaur who had launched an attack that Andreas had managed to escape and was standing behind it, while the Minotaur was growling and looking for Andreas, but quickly found him and turned back, glancing towards Andreas with its eyes glowing red with anger and blood drooling from its nose. It growled and exhaled as if it was about to charge again towards Andreas. Abruptly, Andreas dashed forward towards a Minotaur as his eyes sparkled with confidence in his face and launched a huge, swift counterattack on the Minotaur, easily slashing it off. As he clenched his jaw after launching the attack, the severed head of the Minotaur fell on the ground suddenly, as its body stood still, only possible due to such swift attack from Andreas, who stood there holding his sword in his hand. Sheathing his sword, he wiped the sweat off his face as he gasped and took a long breath. He thought to himself how, since floors 27 and above didn't even exist in the game, it was quite tough. Making his way towards the door, he thought to himself about the 30th floor, the last one, and he couldn't wait to see how strong the enemies were. Ending his chain of thoughts about the last floor, he made his way towards the door as it opened itself. As Andreas was being aired in the spectator room for students who had finished their exams, the students started talking to themselves how at last Andreas Cromwell had reached the final floor. In the spectator room was Vivienne and Diane, who were keenly observing Andreas and Diane, with a shocked expression and sweat dripping from her exclaimed wow, telling how Andreas had actually made it, and not only he had broken Maximin's record, he even reached the top while Vivienne's full attention was towards Andreas, but abruptly broke her silence telling how Andreas was still such a far figure, which stumbled Diane as she couldn't believe it coming out from Vivienne's mouth. Instantly, Vivienne turned backwards and started to move while Diane gazed at her with confusion in her mind as she started to move out of the blue, leaving Andreas's fight. Abruptly, Diane broke her silence and addressed Vivienne, asking where she was going while Vivienne was slowly started to leave the spectator room but instantly turned back glancing towards Diane. She replied training and confidently said she would rather train because Andreas was definitely going to win. Hearing what Vivienne just said confidently, and seeing her blind trust on Andreas's capabilities shocked her, and was left in a state of awe as she continued gazing upon Vivienne with wide eyes and sweat dripping from her face. It was raining quite heavily while Andreas made his way through the dense forest towards the 30th floor. Looking sideways, he thought to himself how he had been walking for a while, but he hadn't seen a single mob yet. As he walked through the forest, he came through a place with many branches. He questioned himself if he was just going to walk out of there without doing anything, and thought how there was no way the 29th floor was the last one. As he was walking forward, he heard someone say raise from the trunks and branches which laid on the ground. As it caught his attention, he looked downwards to see what it was, but soon was left in a state of shock as several trunks and branches started to come to life as it appeared from under the ground. Soon, a giant tree monster started to appear from under the ground, and it was huge, the boss of the 30th floor. Meanwhile, Andreas, witnessing it, exclaimed, "Speak of the devil." As it started to stand up on its feet, Andreas, with a serious look on his face, gave a death stare to the boss while a click sound appeared when he unsheathed his sword. The boss gazed back at Andreas as its eyes glowed bright, and it stared onto Andreas with intent to kill. The boss of the 30th floor. Grassel was the name of the giant tree monster which, when standing up, was as big as a building. It continued staring upon Andreas, who stood in front of him with his sword unsheathed, maintaining his fighting stance. Glancing back at Grassel, Andreas grinned with confidence in his eyes and exclaimed how it was interesting as he questioned himself, straight to the boss fight. Suddenly, Grassel pulled back its hand and growled with a big whoop. Large creak sound came out from it as it moved its body. Meanwhile, Andreas maintained his fighting stance as he was expecting an attack from Grassel. Abruptly, Grassel launched a swift attack by his huge hands onto Andreas, who quickly jumped and managed to dodge the attack. The attack was so furious that several rocks and gusts of smoke started to fly everywhere as its hand landed at the ground. While dodging the attack, Andreas, who was in midair, looked at Grassel and thought to himself how although fire-based magic is effective against a tree-type enemy, but in that rain, it was unlikely to do much damage. Instantly, Grassel, who was not satisfied with its previous attack, growled and launched yet another attack with its hand dashing forward towards Andreas, who with his sword launched yet another counterattack, swiftly cutting Grassel's fingers with ease. Grassel was left in a state of anguish. His eyes were filled with anger as he yelled and growled even loudly. While Andreas dashed back after launching a counterattack upon Grassel, who, with a surprised look on his face, stared at his hands which were missing its fingers as its fingers were scattered mid-air after being cut by Andreas. Abruptly, the fingers that Andreas had just now severed had regenerated as Grassel started into it and used his own magic. Andreas was left in a state of shock as he witnessed what was happening, and he questioned himself what was with that regeneration speed and concluded that it was not going to let him win that easily. Suddenly, one of Grassel's branches had successfully managed to grab Andreas by his foot while he was left in his own thoughts trying to process the tree monster. Abruptly, the tree monster picked Andreas by his foot and hung him upside down, but Andreas, being the quick guy he is, suddenly launched his sword and cut off the branch that was holding him with his attack wind cutter. Andreas quickly got on the ground and maintained his fighting composure while Grassel, looking at its severed branch and Andreas, with his eyes glowing bright and his face filled with anger from not being able to harm Andreas, he soon started to open his chest from which a bright orange light started to appear. Andreas was left in a state of confusion as he tried to comprehend what the tree monster's next attack was, and he had never seen such an attack like this in his life. Soon, the tree monster fully opened its chest and several small green-like objects started to launch from his chest that were aimed towards Andreas with the hopes to take him with this attack. The green objects that Grassel launched were different as roots and branches started to appear from it, leaving Andreas in a nervous state as he questioned himself what that was and concluded that it would be hard to deal with, since he didn't have any information on it. So he raised hand and cast his spell Earth Shield, with which a huge rock appeared from him that he used to block the attack launched by Grassel. Although his shield successfully managed to block the attacks, he was still left in a state of shock as he tried to comprehend what it was. Abruptly, a huge green explosion occurred in front of him, leaving him surprised as to how such small objects could cause such an explosion. The explosion started to get even bigger while Andreas dashed back, trying to get back from the explosion with the hope of not getting anguished by it. Abruptly, the explosion turned into a huge pile of bushes and branches that engulfed Andreas's earth shield whole with ease, while Andreas, who was witnessing everything, was left in a state of shock. As the leaves and petals flew around him, Andreas, with a serious look on his face, thought to himself how he would be screwed if he were to get hit by those things. Instantly, Grassel launched yet another counterattack, destroying the earth shield that was cast by Andreas, who jumped back, successfully managing to dodge yet another counterattack. Placing his hand on the ground and using it as support, he gazed towards Grassel and wondered how, if he were to show any openings, the roots hidden in the ground would attack him. Looking at Grassel, Andreas stood up and thought how, on the other hand, there was its main body which kept regenerating, and on the other, its spore attacks. Thinking how troublesome the main boss was, Andreas stared into Grassel, who was growling with anger, while Andreas thought to himself how there was no time to search for its core or its weak points, or to cast big magic, so he concluded that he had got no choice but to finish it all in one shot. With a look of surprise, Andreas thought in one shot and told as he figured out what he had to do and how to defeat an opponent like Grassel. All the students in the spectator room were keenly observing the live display device where Andreas fought the 30th level boss as he swiftly dodged his attacks. All of a sudden, one of the students, folding both of his hands, told his classmates how Andreas had been running around for 30 minutes, and it looked like that was as far as he could go. While his classmates were keenly listening to him, Diane, with a look of surprise, couldn't keep her eyes off of Andreas. While one of the students stated that just getting this far was already setting a new record, so he was sure that he would be satisfied with that. The other student replied saying how it was a shame, for he really thought Andreas would make it to the top. Meanwhile, Diane glanced back at them, listening to what they were saying, and immediately looked in front of her towards Andreas at the live display, with hopes in her eyes, thinking to herself how now that he had come this far, she wanted to root for him. Looking at the huge live display device, one of the students told to look at him and how he was so tired that he had been dragging his sword around. Meanwhile, Diane was confused about what he had been doing, but instantly, with a look of realization, she widened her gaze as sweat dripped from her face, and she slowly whispered to herself that he was not just running around. She closely watched at Andreas's sword and how he had been dragging it around, leaving gust of smokes as he dragged his sword even further. However, Grassel was not one to back down, so he fiercely kept on launching several spores attack towards Andreas, which he dodged easily with his speed and his stamina as he smiled and looked back at the explosions caused by the spore attack, which glowed bright green, leaving leaves and petals scattered everywhere. Bart Alvin, looking at what Andreas had done, gave a grin on his face and told what outrageous boy Andreas was, while the elder, with a look of surprise and sweat dripping from his face, couldn't believe what Andreas had managed to do, and it was all his plan all along. Meanwhile, another female with a scar on her face nervously looked at Andreas as she couldn't believe herself and told that was so stupidly big. Diane, clenching her fist, gave a surprised look on her face as sweat dripped as she tried to comprehend how Andreas could do that in such a dire situation and claimed that was an off the scale. She quickly reminisced about the time she, with the help of Ketchlung, had created a magic circle. Andreas was not just running around dragging his sword, he had managed to dodge every attack of Grassel successfully and create a big magic circle around him, while he stood in the middle, totally unknown about what Andreas had been doing and was going to do. Looking at what Andreas had created, Diane said that it was a giant amplification magic. And just like that, Andreas finished the last bit of circle he had left and exclaimed, "Done." With sword emitting flame, Andreas, raising his hand while his eyes glowed with confidence as he confidently gazed towards Grassel, and gave a slight grin as he addressed him as Timberhead and told, "This is the end." The monstrous Grassel was roaring ferociously, preparing to launch a powerful attack at him. But Andreas, with a determined look on his face, seemed like he was prepared for the attack. Grassel immediately raised his right hand to launch a powerful attack, but Andreas swiftly jumped away from where he was standing in order to dodge the attack. But Andreas, being the clever one, didn't just dodge the attack, but he even climbed the body of Grassel with his sword up, ready to attack the weak spot of the monster. So Andreas quickly moved behind Grassel and used his glowing sword viciously piercing his sword right behind the monster's neck. Andreas started to realize that this was the exact place where he wanted Grassel to be, and with a grin on his face, as he was piercing the sword, he used the spell Firewall without wasting any more time. As soon as Andreas used the spell, the magic amplification circle that he had prepared a while back started to glow, enveloping a powerful light on the circle. As Grassel was standing on top of the circle, the firewall that Andreas used started to envelope Grassel from the circle, which viciously started to burn the monster into oblivion. Even the television screen had some kind of glitch when it showed the huge burst of flames that enveloped the monster. Meanwhile, the commentator stated that Andreas had finally made his move on the 30th floor boss, Grassel, and mentioned how right at that moment, for the first time in the history of the Academy, the 30th floor had been cleared. Everyone who witnessed with their own eyes were left in a state of bewilderment, as they couldn't not believe that Andreas actually beat the 30th floor boss. Even Diane had a look of surprise as she thought to herself how she was wondering why Andreas didn't attack, but it turned out that he was actually creating an amplification circle. She looked as if she was terrified as she wondered how Andreas had more than enough mana to cast an amplification magic circle of that scale. While the rain was pouring heavily, Grassel had fully turned into black because of getting burnt, but the bottom half of the body was still intact to the ground. Andreas was trying to catch his breath because of the amount of mana he had to use those spells. Looking at the bottom half of Grassel's body, he thought to himself how the monster should not be able to regenerate after taking such a blow. Meanwhile, the other playable character who was watching everything that happened with Andreas had a smile on her face, acknowledging him for being an unbelievable boy. She glanced at the Vice Commander Denard Slay, who was standing next to her, and stated that the more she looked at Andreas, the more fascinating he was. Then, with a cunning smile, she asked the commander what he thought about him. Vice Commander Denard Slay looked back at her and stated that Andreas was indeed fascinating. He further stated how in the present time, his nobility was a title in name only, so there should be no problem recruiting him. Then, with a grim smile on her face, she replied to the Vice Commander that they should bring him in. Then, with a serious look, he told her that they should make their move right there. Suddenly, the Vice Commander in a commanding voice announced to everyone how it seemed that Her Highness the Third Princess wished to make the first move. The mysterious playable character turned out to be a princess. She slowly got up from her chair as she stated that no one should worry about it. As she fully stood up, she had a glow on her face as she exclaimed how she planned to give Andreas the most tempting offer of all. In the meantime, Andreas was holding a mysterious-looking stone in his hand. Suddenly, a system notification popped stating that the stone was the Rune Stone of Desire. Another system notification popped right after that, which stated that the Rune Stone was given to the first person to clear the 30th floor of the tower. Furthermore, it mentions how the reward was increased to 2 when used within the tower. Then, Andreas, looking at the stone, thought to himself how it looked at the stone was used in the actual tower in the Imperial Palace, which might come handy to him in the future. Suddenly, he quickly glanced back to see what was going on, but it was a small portal which was starting to appear behind him. Looking carefully at the portal, Andreas thought to himself how this portal might take him to the exit. He continued wondering how he thought he would be forcibly teleported back to the entrance as he slowly raised his hand and moved it inside the portal. In the meantime, everyone who was present there was eagerly waiting for Andreas to walk out from the portal, but as he was nowhere to be seen, some of them were asking why Andreas hadn't come out yet. Even the third princess was present there with the vice commander right behind him. She then told him that she had to come there because the live feed ended, so they should wait a little longer for Andreas. Suddenly, the commentator announced that they were currently investigating the cause of the delay in his return. Listening to this announcement, the princess with a cunning look thought to herself how Andreas was leaving her on the edge right from the get-go. Meanwhile, it looked like Andreas finally making his way out of the portal as his right leg could be seen. But as soon as he got out of the portal, his expression changed as he looked a bit surprised. Suddenly, he was inside a mysterious-looking place with a long stair in front of him with a mysterious door right on top of the stairs. Andreas couldn't believe that he was transported to a hidden stage. As he slowly made his way up the stairs, he started to wonder that he had been through the game so many times, but he never knew about this. As he reached the luxurious door, he raised both his hands to open the door while he thought to himself that there was no option to go back then. With a determined look on his face, Andreas finally opened the door, but as soon as he opened the door, there was a sudden change in his expression as he looked bewildered as to where he was. The mysterious door led him to a place which was full of several types of magic circles, which was something Andreas was never expecting to witness in the game. Looking at the place, he thought to himself that the place was filled with an enormous number of magic circles, interlocked like cogs, which was creating a single huge magic. He then concluded that this was what formed the Madras Tower. Andreas was in awe as he couldn't comprehend why he was transported to such a place instead of transporting him back to where the event was being held. As he was making his way to the glowing magic ball, which was emitting a powerful mana from the middle of the platform, he heard a voice calling him a student of Rodlin and congratulating him for reaching the top floor. Suddenly, a mysterious person who looked like a powerful mage appeared in front of him as he started stating how this was a hidden floor that only the first to clear the 30th floor could enter. He further mentioned that it was invincible from the outside through layers upon layers of ancient warding magic. Hearing what the mysterious person just said made Andreas wonder how it looked like it was just a psychic projection, but was surprised that it had incredible amounts of mana. But with a smile on his face, the mysterious person told him that it was a delight for him to meet Andreas, the first and the last to meet him. He then introduced himself as Madras Alvin, the first head of the Alvin family. Listening to his name and what he had to say brought a stern look on Andreas's face as he thought to himself that even though it was only a psychic projection of the person who died hundreds of years ago, he still had not expected that it would be Bak's ancestor who would appear there. Then Madras Alvin carefully looked at Andreas and called him a taciturn young man, but since he had made it there, Madras was sure that Andreas was quite capable. He continued stating how he had hoped that one of his descendants would be the one to make it there, questioning himself if they did not inherit his magic talents. In the meantime, Andreas, who was listening to Madras attentively, thought how the projection of Madras Alvin talked a lot. But Madras continued stating that in recognition of Andreas's capabilities, he would give him a reward. Hearing the word reward made Andreas a bit curious, so he asked Madras what the reward would be. Then, in a cunning voice, Madras told him that he was honest with his desires, but the reward would not be for free. As Andreas was confidently standing in front of him, Madras slowly started to walk towards him. With a fierce look on his face, Madras sternly told Andreas that he had one final challenge for him, and that was to try and defeat him. Suddenly, both of Madras's feet started to emit a blue, powerful mana underneath them. In a matter of seconds, the blue mana and several enormous magic circles started enveloping all around him, which swiftly attacked Andreas without Madras even making a single step towards him. The attack was so powerful that he couldn't do anything to dodge from the attack, but he did everything he could to not get knocked out completely. Andreas had a furious look on his face as he called Madras an old fart and accused him for attacking him out of nowhere. On the other hand, Madras was laughing at Andreas, telling him to show him what he had. He then called Andreas a young man who would usher in a new era. But Andreas told him that he couldn't speak about his magic talents. He then started to wonder how even if it was just his psychic projection, he didn't expect he had to fight a legendary warlock. With a cunning look on his face, Andreas moved his hand to grab the sword as he was also prepared for the fight. He then told Madras that if it was mean-spiritedness, he sure had it in him. Listening to Andreas made him laugh in joy, stating that it was wonderful to hear that. Then Andreas thought to himself how since he had no choice but to fight, he should calm down first. He continued thinking that compared to Madras when he was alive, the one right there was sure weaker. As Madras was emitting the blue mana and the enormous magic circles around him, Andreas quickly started to make his move towards Madras, but at the same time he wondered that the place he was fighting in couldn't be seen from the outside, so he had a chance of winning the fight. Without wasting any time, Madras made a unique hand sign with both his hands and used a spell named Giga Cyclone. Slowly, huge number of small black dots started to appear all around him. But Andreas was not fazed by the spell which Madras just used, so he quickly moved towards him at an incredible pace in between the small hole. With a determined look on his face, Andreas swiftly jumped towards Madras with his sword, ready to launch a powerful blow. Madras was bewildered how easily Andreas dodged his spell, as he thought to himself how bold it was of Andreas to move past through the gap. But even Madras was not fazed by Andreas's attack as he firmly stood his ground while Andreas viciously was coming at him as he used his spell, Wind Cutter. Watching Andreas come out to attack with his sword made Madras wonder how interesting it was to witness a sword-wielding mage, but with a fierce look he told Andreas that the sword wouldn't be enough to defeat him. Madras then raised both his hands to defend against Andreas's attack. But watching Madras try to defend the attack brought a smile on his face as he thought how his plan might work. Out of nowhere, a summoning portal appeared right behind Madras, and the one who was summoned was none other than Nickel, the swordsmaster himself. Nickel swiftly came from the blind spot of Madras and taking the advantage, he viciously cut him into two halves. Even after being cut into half, Madras was still alive, but he had a terrified look on his face as he thought to himself how it was an undead who attacked him. After a strong attack, Nickel hit the ground and slid back toward Andreas. He quickly got ready to strike Madras again, while Andreas thought about attacking him too. With a fearless smile on his face, Madras looked down at Andreas and said, "I must commend you for that. Well done on outsmarting me. Now let's see how you handle this." All of a sudden, Timer was summoned towards and charged at Madras with full force. He slammed both fists into him with incredible power, creating a huge explosion that shook the area. The area was fully covered with the smoke. Andreas, Nickel, and Timer, all three of them were watching towards the smoke on the ground where the Madras Alvin was slammed down. Suddenly, Madras's voice echoed from the thick smoke, saying, "How delightful. You certainly know how to make things more interesting." Nickel and Andreas exchanged confused looks, unsure of what just happened or what Madras was planning next. Timer stood nearby, his fists still clenched, staring intently at the smoke, ready for whatever might come next. Out of nowhere, a blue tornado-like aura began to rise from the ground where Madras had been slammed. His voice echoed through the chaos, saying, "Using both magic and a sword at the same time is already rare, but I think someone who can wield black magic is a student of the Academy." Timer quickly dodged the swirling blue aura and slid back toward Andreas, while Andreas and Nickel stood still, watching the scene unfold. With a tired expression, Andreas thought to himself, "I knew it. That wasn't enough to take him down." Suddenly, Madras Alvin appeared beneath the clock. With a serious look, he said, "You're making a mistake." He floated into the air beneath the clock using his magic and began to explain, "I'm not human but a psychic projection." Meanwhile, Andreas, Nickel, and Timer looked up at him from the ground, ready to launch their attack. With a fearless expression and a wicked laugh, Madras said, "Foolishly beating up an old man with no body won't get you anywhere." Huh. Suddenly, Madras unleashed a powerful magic attack called Wind Spear against the three of them. The attack surrounded them completely, but they dodged the attack. Madras's voice echoed as he followed up the powerful Wind Spear attack with a declaration of boom. The three of them stood in confusion, uncertain about what would happen next. While running, Andreas glanced back at the attack and thought to himself, "It seems pointless to attack that old geezer." He continued dodging the attacks tirelessly until his eyes caught sight of a clock above Madras. As I suspected, he murmured to himself, "Out of the three smaller ones, only one appears to be functioning right now." Madras glanced down at Andreas and thought, "Darting around like a squirrel. This will never end at this rate." Suddenly, one of the three clocks began emitting lightning. Andreas looked up at it with a serious expression. With lightning crackling around him and an evil smile, Madras sneered, "Shall we shake things up a bit?" The area was soon engulfed by dark clouds, crackling with intense lightning. Andreas gazed at the ominous clouds, feeling a mix of confusion and unease. Without hesitation, Madras unleashed a devastating attack called Heartless Thunder, engulfing the entire area in lightning. Andreas braced himself, preparing to face the oncoming assault. The attack was so powerful that Andreas and Timer tried to defend against it, but the thunder's force was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Nickel watched the attack, uncertain of what to do next. The immense magic of Heartless Thunder enveloped Andreas, making it difficult for him to bear. He ordered Nickel to interrupt the magic, and without hesitation, Nickel listened to the command and agreed. Hearing Andreas, Madras looked down at them, his expression filled with confusion. Suddenly, Nickel charged toward Madras, swinging his sword to launch an attack, while Andreas remained trapped under the heavy spell cast by Madras, struggling to defend himself. Nickel launched his attack at Madras, but he swiftly dodged and vanished from his position. In an instant, he reappeared behind Nickel, murmuring, "How bothersome," and prepared to strike. He suddenly unleashed a powerful thunder attack at Nickel, but Nickel deflected it with his sword, sending it back toward Madras. Dodging the attack, Madras scoffed, "Humph. In that case, I'll just overpower you with pure firepower." Madras unleashed a powerful magic, attacking Nickel with a fierce combination of fire and thunder. As Andreas watched Nickel being attacked by Madras, he thought to himself, no matter how strong an undead is, continuous hits from lightning magic will destroy him. Madras gathered the full force of lightning and fire, channeling immense magical power to strike Nickel. He shouted, Now let's see how long you can last. Meanwhile, Nickel did his best to dodge the incoming powerful attack. Realizing that Nickel wouldn't be able to dodge the attack and would be destroyed by a direct hit, Andreas urgently called out for Nickel to fall back. Modras glanced down at Andreas, confused, just as his immense spell struck the ground in front of Andreas with overwhelming force. With a bold, cold expression from above, Modras remarked, just when things were beginning to get interesting. As Andreas looked up at Modras, he thought to himself, there's no way Modras doesn't know that undead and lightning magic are incompatible. Yet, he continues to use it against him, just like now. That means... A smile spread across his face as he said, you can only wield the elements controlled by that revolving clock, except for spatial magic, can't you? Modras looked slightly confused by Andreas's words and wondered, how did he figure that out? With a faint smile, Modras looked at Andreas and said, well done for figuring that out. It's a rule set by Modras when he left me here. Modras gathered immense magic in his hand once more and said, without any restrictions, no matter how many tower conquerors there are, it would be impossible for them to defeat me. But this is nothing more than a handicap. That said, if you can't even land a fatal blow on me. Modras launched the attack at Andreas, who was on the ground, yelling, you don't stand a chance. His tone was full of disdain, as he believed there was no way Andreas could defeat him. The powerful attack struck the ground, causing a massive explosion. Andreas narrowly dodged the blast and quickly started running to escape the blast zone. Andreas quickly glanced up at Modras, questioning himself, should I go for an offensive attack or focus on magic? Or perhaps try a war of attrition? He then considered, either way, since he's a psychic projection, he'll vanish once his mana is exhausted. AMD casting magic repeatedly like that must drain a ton of mana. Modras was channeling an immense lightning magic, both hands raised, his expression serious as he focused on the clock below. Andreas suddenly closed his eyes, focusing all his attention on sensing the flow of mana around him. He could feel the powerful surge emanating from Modras, his concentration growing sharper with each passing moment. As he delved deeper into the flow, he finally pieced together how the mana was being channeled and controlled, realizing the pattern and source behind it. It's those pillars. They're the ones providing him with a constant supply of mana, aren't they? It all makes sense now. Andreas, then dodging the thunder attack aimed at him, began to figure out what he had to do to defeat Modras. So with a cunning smile, Andreas glanced towards Modras and began to wonder how the answer was clear. Meanwhile, Modras, who was constantly attacking Andreas, gave a puzzled expression as he felt that Andreas had figured him out. Modras, sensing the danger, immediately launched another round of thunder spears which rushed towards Andreas. In response, Andreas instantly used the spell Earth Shield, creating a huge earth wall to block his attack. As a result, Modras' thunder spears got stuck on the earth shield Andreas conjured. Andreas, then looking at the spears, thought since the elements he could use were fixed, it was easy to counter them. Suddenly, to Andreas's surprise, Modras appeared behind him as he pointed out that Andreas said it himself as those restrictions would not include spatial magic. Andreas then instantly turned behind to see Modras as he knew that Modras would not let this chance go. Just as Andreas expected, Modras, without any hesitation, launched his thunder attack on Andreas. But the results of the attack were not as Modras had expected, which made him even more curious about Andreas. At the same time, Andreas had used his black magic to make a barrier to deflect Modras's attack, which made Modras question him if he was not yet done amusing him. Furthermore, Modras pointed out that he was using double chant of magic and black magic. So Modras concluded that he thought Andreas was an upright young man, but it turns out he was quite the tricky one. In response, Andreas, with a look of confidence, told Modras that he thought he was the one with so much to hide. Modras then gave a joyous laugh, ho-ho, and told Andreas that was what they call the virtue of age. Modras then did something to the huge magic clock with different elements of magic imbued in it and pointed out, saying, now that your elemental advantage is going to disappear, and began channeling light blue mana on the palm of his hand. Listening to what Modras just said, Andreas opened his eyes wide open in shock as to what was about to happen. Immediately, Modras launched the spell Aqua Field, which made a huge burst of water to rush out of all directions. Meanwhile, Andreas kept paying close attention and exclaimed shit as he figured out that Modras was trying to take control from above. In just a few seconds, the whole air was filled by water all around, while Andreas, Timer, and Modras were ready to face off against one another. Andreas then immediately glanced at Timer and called for him, to which Timer, understanding Andreas, immediately knew what he had to do. So both Andreas and Timer rushed on opposite direction, while Madras kept looking at them in surprise as he questioned himself if they were each aiming for a different pillar. Madras then immediately dashed and appeared ahead of Timer and asked him where he was going in such a hurry. Madras then, without any delays, immediately launched his spell Hydra Wave, which created huge Hydra-like creatures from the water that launched towards Timer. Meanwhile, Andreas, as he rushed towards the other pillar, glanced back and saw what Madras was doing to Timer, but had no choice as he knew if Madras went for Timer, then he would bet to the pillar first. But to Andreas' surprise, Madras launched another spell, Water Prison, which made Andreas weary and turned back towards Madras. But what Andreas had not comprehended was that Madras had launched the spell towards Andreas, which immediately created a huge water prison that surrounded Andreas. Simultaneously, the water prison enveloped Andreas entirely, making him unable to break free. Madras then, with a grim smile, holding his hat, exclaimed, "Checkmate." Meanwhile, Andreas was struggling to even breathe inside the water prison that Madras had trapped him in, but he was still determined to not give up, and in that split second, Andreas channeled his mana on the palm of his hand to try to use his summoning magic. Witnessing this, Madras, making an annoyed expression, pointed out that one after another, Andreas just never lets him get bored. The summoning magic Andreas used was to summon his huge giant companion, who immediately destroyed one of the pillars as Madras just stood there watching the whole thing unfold. Madras then made a displeased expression and began wondering how even back in his ear there were no giants. Andreas's huge giant then stood in front of Madras, holding his huge sword, ready to launch his furious attack. Without anything hesitation, then huge giant then swung his huge sword straight down the water prison where Andreas was trapped. The giant's swing was so powerful that it sent a huge wave in all directions. After all his efforts, the water prison was finally broken as Andreas swept out from the water prison and broke free. Andreas then began coughing as he had almost drowned in the water prison and tried to maintain his stance. Meanwhile, Madras flew up and began exclaiming good and that it would have been boring if things ended like that, while the huge giant and Andreas stood there staring at Madras. Andreas, determined to defeat Madras, called him Master Madras and told him that he better be careful as he had already lost one of his most precious lives.